The Vornathi fleet stood looming in the darkness of space, their warships arranged in tight formation, each one a testament to their superiority. They were the pinnacle of galactic dominance, their power unmatched in every quadrant. And in the middle of their armada, floating like an insignificant speck, was the human vessel Unity, battered and scarred from the relentless assault. David Ralston stood at the helm of the bridge, his hands gripping the cold metal controls, a slight smirk playing at the edges of his lips. Around him, the crew scrambled, their faces pale with exhaustion, yet their eyes glinted with the same stubborn defiance that had driven humanity to survive countless wars and catastrophes. "Sir, shields down to 15%, a voice called out from across the room, trembling with tension. David didn't flinch. He had seen this before. Seen the flashing red lights, the high-pitched screech of metal under stress. It was all part of the game now. "Keep steady," David said, his voice calm. "We're not done yet." Outside the bridge's reinforced glass windows, the Vornathi warships fired again, their energy beams slicing through the dark expanse of space. Each strike hit Unity with the force of a meteor, shaking the ship violently. But David Ralston didn't move. His gaze was fixed, unwavering, even as the ship groaned under the weight of the bombardment. "Are you insane?" Lieutenant Hayes shouted, her voice rising with panic. She stood beside him, eyes wide in disbelief. "They'll tear us apart." David turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with an unreadable expression. "They think we're scared. But we're not." Hayes clenched her fists, glancing back at the screens where Vornathi ships hovered in the distance, their firepower overwhelming. "You're not scared?" "We're..." A sharp crack echoed through the hull. The ship shuddered, and the lights flickered. David's smile didn't waver. Instead, he let out a deep, hearty laugh, loud enough to echo across the bridge. His laughter was not the hollow, desperate sound of someone about to break. No. It was a defiant roar, a challenge to the alien forces surrounding them. The entire bridge fell silent. The crew exchanged uncertain glances, confusion clouding their faces. The Vornathi forces, calculating, ruthless, were baffled. Why was this human laughing? "Captain?" Hayes asked cautiously, her voice cracking slightly. "What's going on? Why are you laughing?" David's laugh subsided, but his eyes remained fixed on the readouts, tracking the incoming fire. "It's not about them," he said slowly, his voice low but filled with an undeniable resolve. "It's about us. The Vornathi think they can break us, but they've underestimated humanity. Underestimated what we can endure." His words cut through the tension like a blade. There was no fear in his tone, no hesitation. His defiance was a weapon in itself, and the aliens couldn't understand it. Hayes looked at him, still unsure, but there was something in his gaze, something that grounded her. Another explosion rocked the ship, sending a jolt through the bridge. But David did not flinch. His gaze remained locked ahead, and his lips curled into a smirk again. The aliens were relentless, firing their weapons with terrifying precision. But Unity held together, stubborn and defiant, like its captain. Hayes glanced at the readouts again. Their shields were failing. Systems were flickering. The Vornathi were not relenting. "We need to get out of here, Captain. We can't hold out much longer." David didn't reply immediately. He let the sound of the ship's groaning hull fill the silence for a moment. Then he turned, his eyes colder than ice, yet burning with something more than anger. "We're not running. Not today." The crew watched him in stunned silence. He was unbreakable, not because he wasn't human, but because he was more human than any of them had ever dared to be. The laughter still lingered in the air, as if defying the very concept of fear. The Vornathi had never encountered anything like this. It was their turn to be unsettled. The Vornathi fleet had no idea what was coming next. But David did. And in that moment, Unity wasn't just a ship. It was a symbol of resistance, of resilience, of the human spirit. Outside, the Vornathi ships fired once more, their beams of destruction illuminating the dark void. And David Ralston laughed again. The sound rang out across the bridge like a challenge, a declaration: "We are not finished yet." The Vornathi fleet had not anticipated a human's defiance. Their command ship hovered in the void, a hulking mass of metal and energy, its sleek design belying the ruthless might it contained. Captain Stahl watched through the bridge's observation windows as the human ship Unity floated, still alive, still stubbornly defiant. The latest barrage had rattled the human vessel, but it hadn't broken. "How is this possible?" Stahl growled, his sharp alien features twisted in confusion. Their shields should have collapsed by now. Beside him, the lead strategist, Rick, her 3 sets of eyes scanning the monitors, turned with a quiet but concerning remark. "The human vessel should be destroyed. Yet it clings to life, refusing to yield. It mocks us." Stahl's mind raced. The Vornathi had conquered countless species, their advanced technology unparalleled. But these humans, something was different about them. They were not like the others. No, they were more insidious. They fought not with weapons alone, but with something Stahl couldn't quite grasp. "Prepare another bombardment," Stahl ordered. His voice carried authority, but beneath it simmered a growing unease. "I want them to understand their fate." Back on Unity, the crew braced themselves as the new wave of Vornathi fire approached. David Ralston, their captain, was still unmoved. His eyes flicked over the damage reports, the buzzing screens indicating the final stages of their ship's breakdown. The exterior hull was riddled with holes, and the engines sputtered, barely keeping them afloat. But his face, cool, composed, reflected nothing but resolve. "Captain, we can't take much more," Hayes warned, her voice tight with fear. She watched David closely, searching for some sign of hesitation, some break in his iron resolve. He had laughed, earlier, as if this was all part of a twisted game. But now, with everything on the brink of collapse, she needed him to face reality. David didn't answer immediately. His fingers hovered over the console, calculating their next move with the precision of a master tactician. His brow furrowed, but his calm remained unshaken. "We need to show them we won't bend," he said quietly, his voice steady as ever. "They're waiting for us to break, let's give them a show." Hayes was about to protest when a sharp tremor rattled the bridge. The Vornathi had fired again, and this time, the hit was direct. Lights flickered, and the deck groaned as the ship's hull screamed in protest. The Unity lurched forward, throwing the crew off balance. "We're going to need more than a show," Hayes muttered, her voice laced with urgency. She gripped the edge of the console for stability. "We need a miracle." David turned slowly, meeting her eyes with a depth of certainty that chilled her. "Miracles," he said, "are what we create." He keyed in a command, bringing up the ship's remaining firepower, scarce and primitive compared to the Vornathi's weaponry, but enough to cause a disruption. Enough to let them know that humans, despite their apparent frailty, would never bow down quietly. He had spent his life studying human history, the wars, the resistance movements, the unyielding will of people who had fought and died to preserve their freedom. And now, against impossible odds, he stood as the embodiment of that spirit. "Target their main reactor." "Full power," he commanded, his voice a calm before the storm. Hayes hesitated, eyes widening in disbelief. "Are you serious? We're on the edge of annihilation, and you want to—" "Do it," David snapped, cutting her off. The tension in the room was palpable as Hayes relayed the orders. The crew watched in near disbelief as the Unity, crippled and half-dead, pointed its remaining cannons at the Vornathi flagship. Just as the Vornathi fleet launched another volley of energy blasts, Unity fired back. The weak, flickering beam shot across the space between the two vessels, an act of defiance rather than a real threat. Yet, in that moment, the Vornathi command ship shuddered. The shot had disrupted its shield grid, even if only for a moment. It was an imperfection, a crack in the armor. And David's laugh echoed through the bridge again, this time, a soft, low chuckle. Stahl watched the human's feeble retaliation through his flagship's monitors. His eyes widened, disbelief coloring his thoughts. This cannot be. But it was too late. The Vornathi flagship's shield systems briefly faltered under the unexpected human strike. A ripple of confusion swept through the fleet. The humans' resistance, this strange, unbreakable will, had thrown them off balance. They hadn't broken. Not yet. "We can win this," David whispered to himself, his voice carrying the weight of everything humanity had endured and survived. "This is our fight, and we are not done." And just as the Vornathi regrouped, David's final command echoed through the ship. "Now, we make them remember who we are." As the Unity took aim again, ready to strike, the tension in the air crackled, a fragile line between defiance and destruction. Would it be enough? The Unity shuddered under another barrage, and this time, the bridge went dark. Alarms blared, red lights flashing, casting an eerie glow over the crew's tense faces. David Ralston, still standing, his posture unyielding, stared at the flickering control panels. Despite the chaos, his expression was unchanged, calm, even serene in the face of the Vornathi's wrath. "Captain, the main reactor is overheating. We can't hold out much longer." Hayes's voice cracked, her panic evident despite her attempts to control it. David's eyes locked onto the communications panel. "You've got 2 minutes," he said, his voice smooth as glass. "Get us one shot. Just one. Aim for their reactor." Hayes hesitated, a tremor of doubt passing through her. Could they really pull this off? They had pushed past every limit so far, but there was no more room for error. The ship was falling apart. The alien fleet was relentless. Their odds were shrinking with every passing second. "We'll do what we can," Hayes replied, forcing the words through clenched teeth. David didn't need to see the strained expression on her face to know the truth. They were running on fumes. The Unity was holding on by mere threads, nothing more. But David wasn't thinking about the ship or the odds. He wasn't thinking about the Vornathi either. He was thinking about the one thing that had kept humanity alive for centuries, their refusal to be broken. Across the bridge, his crew worked in a fevered frenzy, but it was as if the pressure of the moment was fueling them, not crushing them. The Unity had taken enough punishment to destroy any other fleet, but not this one. Not humanity. Not while David was at the helm. "You're not going to die today," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Hayes glanced up at him, the edges of her face drawn in concentration. "I thought the human species was supposed to be fragile," she said under her breath, half in awe. "You make it look easy." David's smirk was barely visible as he turned his gaze toward the viewport, where the cold vastness of space met the steel hull of the approaching Vornathi fleet. There was no fear in his eyes, only a relentless fire, an ember that had burned through every trial they had faced as a species. "We're not fragile," he said. "We're stubborn." Suddenly, the ship jolted violently, throwing the crew off balance. A loud crack echoed through the hull. Hayes stumbled to catch herself, but David was already moving, his hands dancing over the console with practiced precision. "They've breached the hull," shouted one of the technicians, his voice tight with panic. David took a deep breath, fighting the tightening knot in his stomach. "Steady, people. We're not done yet." His voice was the anchor, the rock in the storm. Hayes watched him, her fear dissipating into something else, something she couldn't quite place. It was almost as if his certainty had infected her. "Target locked," the weapons officer called out. The vibration of the ship's cannon system hummed through the deck. "On your mark, Captain." David nodded once, a single motion that sent his crew into motion. The pressure in the room grew thick, every second stretching into eternity. Outside the ship, the Vornathi fleet's ships gleamed in their perfection, monstrous and unyielding. They had all the power, all the resources. Yet, here they were, facing a human vessel barely holding together, a crew that was clearly outmatched, but unwilling to quit. David's breath was slow, measured. He could feel the weight of everything, of the people depending on him, of the hope flickering in their eyes, of humanity itself standing on the precipice of annihilation. "But we won't go down. Not like this. Now," he ordered, his voice a razor-sharp command. The cannon fired. The shot screamed across the void, striking the heart of the Vornathi flagship. It exploded in a brilliant, blinding flash, a shockwave that rippled through the fleet. For a moment, everything fell silent. The Vornathi flagship, the heart of the fleet, was nothing but debris. David stood motionless as the silence stretched. The whole bridge held its breath, waiting for the final verdict. Target destroyed, the technician confirmed, disbelief thick in his voice. They're retreating. It worked. The crew erupted into hesitant cheers, the pressure breaking at last. Hayes collapsed into her seat, her breath ragged. "We did it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We really did it." David didn't smile, though. He didn't need to. There was something more than relief in his chest, something stronger. The victory wasn't in the destruction of a fleet. It was in the realization of something greater, humanity's defiance. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The Vornathi were a formidable force, and this small victory wouldn't stop them from coming back. But for now, humanity had shown them one thing: they were far from finished. David's eyes remained on the viewport, where the remains of the Vornathi flagship drifted in the silence of space. "We're just getting started," he said quietly. And as the Unity slowly limped away, its engines sputtering but still alive, a fire burned brighter in David's chest, the fire of human resilience. The galaxy hadn't seen anything yet. The silence after the battle was overwhelming, a suffocating blanket that settled over the bridge of Unity. The lights flickered weakly, the hum of the failing engines the only sound as the crew took in the victory. The Vornathi flagship had been destroyed. The fleet had scattered. But the cost was clear. The ship was barely holding together, and the enemy was not finished yet. David Ralston stood at the helm, staring out into the vast, star-streaked void. He didn't look relieved. He didn't even look victorious. His face was a mask of focus, his eyes sharp, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. "Captain," Hayes said, her voice steady despite the exhaustion lining her features. "We've got a problem. The Vornathi aren't just going to let this go. They'll be back, and they'll bring everything they've got." David's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond right away. He could hear Hayes's words, feel the weight of them in his bones. The Vornathi had underestimated humanity's will once, but they wouldn't make the same mistake again. They would regroup, recalibrate, and return with even more force. "Prepare for the next phase," David said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "Get the crew to work on repairs, and get those weapon systems online. We're not running. Not yet." He turned to face Hayes, his gaze intense. "I want a full report on the Vornathi fleet's movements. Now." "Right away," she replied, already moving to her station. David ran a hand through his short, dark hair, his thoughts racing. They had won today, but only by the slimmest of margins. Their victory had been a shock, a testament to human resilience, but it hadn't been enough to decisively end the threat. The Vornathi would regroup. They had to be ready. The crew scrambled to tend to the ship, but David couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. There was something else he needed to understand. The Vornathi's reaction had been too uncertain. They had shown signs of fear. Not just tactical miscalculations, but genuine fear. The kind of fear that came from facing something unknown. "You think they were afraid?" Hayes asked, reading his expression as she approached him. Her tone was low, thoughtful. "We barely scratched them." David turned to her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "No. Not afraid of us. Afraid of what we're capable of. They know we've only just begun to fight back. They know we'll keep coming." The thought chilled him, but there was no room for hesitation. Not now. Humanity had taken its first real step onto the galactic stage. The Vornathi, for all their power, had just realized how dangerous they had made their enemies. "Captain," the communications officer called, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Incoming transmission from the Vornathi command." David tensed, his heart pounding. The aliens had no reason to contact them, not unless they had something significant to say. He motioned for the screen to be activated, and a moment later, the face of Captain Stahl appeared on the main screen. The alien's cold, calculating gaze met David's unflinching stare. "Human," Stahl's voice boomed across the bridge, his tone a low growl. "You have earned our attention. But this is not over. Your resistance will be crushed, and your species will be erased from existence. Prepare yourself." The words hit with the weight of a hammer. The Vornathi were not backing down. But David, in his calm, unwavering manner, leaned forward, his eyes locked on Stahl's. "You're welcome to try," David said, his voice cool, measured, yet filled with the kind of quiet fury that only humans could muster in the face of extinction. "But you won't succeed. We will fight until there is nothing left to fight with." Stahl's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no humor in it. Only cold, ruthless contempt. "We'll see." The transmission cut off, leaving a buzzing silence in its wake. The crew remained frozen, staring at the now dark screen. David exhaled slowly, his mind whirring. He could feel the weight of Stahl's threat hanging in the air like a storm cloud. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for humanity's place in the galaxy. "Prepare for war," David said, his voice steel. "We'll give them a war they've never seen." The crew nodded in silent agreement, their faces grim but resolute. They had already made the impossible possible. They had already proven their defiance. And now, with the eyes of the galaxy on them, they would show the Vornathi that humanity's spirit couldn't be extinguished, no matter the odds. As the Unity limped through the void, repairs underway, David turned toward the vast expanse of space ahead. The next battle would come, and this time, they would be ready. But it wouldn't just be a battle for survival, it would be a battle for the future of humanity. And David Ralston would lead them through it. He would not let humanity fall. Not today. Not ever.